pleasure of knowing Rich Wilson for years and years and years. We started sailing, our fathers were deep water sailors and crossed many oceans, and I think both of us grew up, we both had the bug. But what initially really amazed me about Rich was at the age of 23, 24, I'm not sure what the age was, Rich took his father's boat, which was not a particularly fleet-footed craft, and basically navigated his way to Bermuda in a way that outfoxed all these old-timers, and still to this day holds the record as the youngest skipper of the Bermuda race. And it's really a feat that is remarkable.
Thank you.
But I obviously had a long respect and deep respect for Rich's capabilities as a sailor. But soon after he came back, and I had the opportunity to watch this presentation that you're going to see tonight, it really became clear to me that Rich Wilson is one of the outstanding sailors of our generation, if not the outstanding sailor that's been generated from this area. Rich Wilson.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, James. It's nice to be here. As a sailor, I had followed the Vendee Globe since it began in 1988, yet I never had any interest whatsoever in sailing this race. It's too hard, it's too long, it's too dangerous. The boats are too big, the sails are too big, and you're too far from land or help for most of the race. But for the last 15 years, we had produced programs that linked expeditions and adventures around the world to classrooms. And I had been a school teacher in Boston a long time ago, and the hardest challenge for a school teacher is to get the kids to pay attention. And so we thought that if you can give them a live, let-her-rip adventure where they don't know what's going to happen next, that they will come back the next day to find out what's going to happen next. And you can embed all sorts of science and geography and math in these kinds of programs. And so we had produced, in fact, 75 live full semester programs in partnership with rainforest research centers, marine biology labs, other sailing ships at sea in those 15 years. Now, you also have to have some ocean skills to undertake the Vendee Globe. 3 of the voyages that we used as sitesALIVE programs were clipper ship passages that we undertook ourselves: San Francisco to Boston, New York to Melbourne, the Australian Gold Rush record, Hong Kong to New York, the China tea trade route, and also a 4th voyage that was the solo transatlantic race. For those voyages, we used a 50-foot trimaran named Great American II. It was named Great American II because Great American I was lost off Cape Horn the first time we tried one of these in a double somersaulting capsize in 65-foot seas, which was the official wave height from the rescuing vessel. That's a different story. That story has no slides. Now, some people have asked, where did I get this adventure gene? And I always look to my mother. She grew up in Tacoma, Washington, and then she moved to Fairbanks, Alaska, to help build the first radio station in the Alaskan Territory. She had a program called Tundra Topics. And here she is on the left, swimming in Harding Lake, east of Fairbanks. And yes, all that white stuff behind her is ice. So I'm just trying to keep up with my mother. Now, the school program, a little bit about that. One of the main distribution channels has always been newspapers, newspaper and education departments, where they will commit space to us, and they will then market to teachers locally. And when they publish the piece from whatever program it is that we're doing, they will deliver 30 newspapers to the classroom, to that teacher. And for this program, we've done that now since the early 90s, have published series in hundreds of newspapers. And for this one, we had 25 newspapers across the U.S. So we'd be reaching about 6 or 7 million readers, plus about 250,000 school kids. We have a comprehensive website that we've had since the early 90s, partnerships with places like the AAAS in Washington. Neil Skorka, who was a sitesALIVE veteran, was one who was managing all this back in the office as I was at sea. Now, one of the things that we did We started this with the Transat program that was a solo race across the Atlantic. Since I wouldn't be able to write as much as when we were double-handed on the trimaran, we assembled this team of experts. And these folks were really content partners for us, a wide variety of expertises who would write both for the newspaper series that would go out then to the schools, but also be available online to answer questions for students. This was really a cool thing. Captain Wallachek was head of Kings Point. Sean Connaughton was head of the Maritime Administration in Washington. Professor Newman was aeronautical engineering from MIT. Brian Barneywalt, head of emergency medicine at Tufts, and he played a big role in this race. Chris Fanta was my asthma doctor. I've had asthma since I was a kid. Laura Mirabella, SUNY Maritime graduate and a tanker broker, and talk about being the only woman in an all-male industry. Murray Lister was chief mate of New Zealand Pacific when they rescued us off Cape Horn in that capsize. Janos Mialos, head of the Museum of Science. My trainer, Marty Shea, who is now holds the world amateur time trial championship. David Sobel, I'm sure many of you have read Longitude. Sam Scott, Peabody Essex Museum, Maritime Art Curator. Jan Whitting from SEA, Oceans and Climate. Ambrose Gerald, fisheries expert. Chuck Seisler, sleep expert. Lorraine Leo, technology wizard at the Jackson School in Newton. Rich DeMoulian was my shipmate for the Hong Kong-New York passage, and Scott Hamilton was an Everest veteran. So all these folks were available to the kids. This was a pretty cool thing, because where else could a sixth grader send a question to the likes of these, and they would hear this wide variety of viewpoints. Now, a little bit about the other two constituencies. If I go to sea, I tried to figure out how do I explain my asthma to people, so I finally decided to put up, this is my lung function test. I take 4 drugs a day. That gets me up to this black line versus the normal line, which is the red line for me. You can see there's a big gap in there. My lungs work at about 70% of normal or so. And then also, I would be the oldest skipper in this race of the 30 skippers. So I decided to graph the ages of the 30 skippers. And that's me up there. And there aren't any drugs that help that problem. So here's the boat that we selected, Great American 3, she became. Had been built by Terry Dubois in France, designed by Bernard Nevelt. 60 feet long, 90-foot mast, 18 feet of beam, 14.5-foot draft, twin rudders, single dagger board, carbon mast, fiberglass hull. And just a little bit here, since we're in the Whaling Museum, old-style rigging. There's no turnbuckles on this boat. The shrouds are lashed on with Vectran lashings. Then you pump up with hydraulic pumps the mast against these lashings and put shims under the mast to hold it in place. 7,000 psi, and bar taut has no description of how tight those shrouds are. Here's the sail plan: full mainsail, first reef, second reef, third reef. Got a storm jib on the baby staysails right here. Regular jib on the head stay. Then a reacher, it's a little bit bigger, and the gennaker is masthead to the bowsprit and sheets to the stern. And that's the spinnaker, 3,500 square feet. And you can see the dagger board and how deep the keel is here. One other thing that was interesting about this boat was, since it was fiberglass and would therefore bend more than the carbon boats, there had to be 2 longitudinal bulkheads about a meter in from the side, or from each side. And this gave it longitudinal stiffness. But what it also did was it broke the boat up into many, many compartments. You're required to have 5 watertight compartments on these boats. We had 11, which was kind of a nice thing. Now, I sailed the boat back in April of '06 to the U.S. Alone to try to find out what I might like to change. Had a massive collision with a submerged object about 500 miles south of Iceland. It drove the daggerboard back through the boat, opened up this hole in the hull, drove the daggerboard through the daggerboard trunk, and sheared off one of the 2 rudders. Now, I did have a third rudder on board. It took about 14 hours full on to replace that rudder, but actually that episode gave good confidence, in fact, that I could make a major repair at sea. I also had another sort of medical issue later on. We got thrown across the cabin, ended up fracturing a vertebrae when I did a 1-point landing. And I'm not the only guy that gets hurt on these boats. A lot of people have had problems. Took the boat to Brian Harris in Portland, Maine Yacht Center. Brian's the only guy in America that's worked on 3 of these open 60s for solo around the world races. And we added things like we increased the height of the stanchions. We had the keel acoustically tested for the welds internal to the structure. You can see how big this keel is. Right here is a hinge that holds the keel. The top 5 feet there is a lever. This keel can cant 40 degrees on either side of vertical. And then as well as the keel winch there to control that. We brought all the mainsail controls back to the cockpit so I could put a reef in from the cockpit, put in a pedestal winch as well to drive 3 of the 5 winches. We had 51 separate control lines coming into the cockpit. So good to get some practice in so you put your hand on the right one in the middle of the night. Inside the boat, a lot of electronics. There are 4 satellite telephones. We have 2 autopilot systems, wind instrument systems at the top of the mast, computers, 2 actually networks. We had Linksys routers, Cisco routers on the boat, our desalinator to make fresh water out of the seawater, and satellite text systems, and on and on and on. Very complicated system. You can see a little bit here, the rest of the interior. This is behind the chart table. That's all the cabling. Here's the winch. And these 2 lines here go through that bulkhead to control that keel to cant at 40 degrees either side. Had this cushion in the chart table bench. That was could kind of fold up in different directions to try to make something somewhat comfortable. And then a lot of pockets there for all the debris that ends up, the headlights and things like that. Now, the Open 60 has to be an Open 60. That means it has to go through a 90-degree test, which is tip the boat on its side with a sling to a crane here on the keel. You can see it there. Bring that mast into the dock, put a load cell top of the mast down to the dock, let off the crane, and see how much righting moment is generated with the hull form of the boat and the keel. So we did pass that test. The other thing that's good about it is that you can see actually how high the boat floats when it's laying on its side, and that there's no water coming into the cockpit when it's laying on its side, because the boats tend to take that configuration from time to time. Now, for the brand new boats, they do something more severe. They turn the boat upside down completely. The skipper's inside. They got to be able to right the boat. Most of these keels are now hydraulically controlled, not controlled like ours was with rope, block and tackle. We had 10 parts on each side, and so here you can see Brit Air crashing back upright in her initial test. And that's Armel Lecléache sailing. And here you can see what that keel looks like. You can see it's at about 45-degree angle to the mast. And you also just get a sense from that picture how big these boats are. They're really pretty big, and the new ones are wider than the old ones. Now, along with the development of the boat, we were developing the school program. So I went to a World Association of Newspapers conference, newspapers from 74 countries around the world. I personally spoke with newspapers from 37 countries, and they were really intrigued by this idea. It wasn't a French yacht race. This was a live ocean expedition. And we're going to have science and geography and math and flying fish and new stars and nutrition and sleep and so forth, all sorts of stuff. And the people really liked it. And these newspapers were from everywhere. So that gave us a great encouragement we'll be able to pull this off. So here was the first voyage back, solo. I sailed back to France then with Mike Birch, a legendary Canadian sailor, to set up for a race to Brazil that was double-handed, and then back to France in the solo qualifier. The race requires you to finish in your boat a single-handed transatlantic race merely to qualify for the start. I took the boat to Port La Forêt in Brittany, to Hubert Desjoyeau's yard. Hubert was the brother of Michel, who's, I believe, is the greatest sailor in the world. Hubert builds the boats, Michel races them, and it's a pretty good combination. We would have 2 sailors, Hugues Rius, a French sailor, and Rick Williams, who would help us prepare the boat the final 4 months before the start. Now, I put this triangle up here with numbers. try to get a little respect for ocean racing. Those numbers are accurate. 3,000 have summited Everest, 500 astronauts, and only 50 people have sailed solo nonstop around the world. Only 2 Americans had ever entered this race before. Mike Plant sailed the first race in 88, 89, completed the course, didn't finish officially, had to stop in New Zealand for a repair. Sailing to the start of the 92 race, he was lost at sea. Bruce Schwab sailed the 2004 race and finished 9th place. Now, here's the bit of the problem. This is one of the new Open 60s, and at speed, you have to be able to cook, sleep, do all your navigation, repair fiberglass, repair carbon fiber, be able to slow the boat, go to the top of the mast, make all your sail changes, stop the boat, go to the bottom of the keel, and on and on and on. Reboot the computers, fix the cameras, fix the sails, do rigging repairs. And just because the video stopped doesn't mean it stopped for the skipper. It never stops.
What's that speed?
In the probably early 20s, mid 20s or so. Here are the skippers. This is a big deal French sports event. You can see the press surrounding the 30 skippers there before the start. And on the dock at the start, 750,000 people came in those 3 weeks before the start of the race, 35,000 people a day. It was amazing. And they are completely in your camp. They have a different attitude about sports, I think, than we do here in the U.S. If I ever get a chance to talk to an American journalist, which was pretty rare, they'd eventually get around to saying, well, you're going to win. And of course, if they'd done any homework at all, they'd know the answer to that, which was, of course not. I was in the 3-generation-old boat. I was the oldest skipper. We don't have any of these kinds of races in the U.S. The French are the best. But that wasn't our purpose. Our purpose was the school program. So then the American journalists would finally say, well, what are you doing it for? And the French just really had a different attitude. They just said, si vous finissez la course, vous êtes un vainqueur. If you finish this race, you're a winner. And a 10-year-old boy on the dock said to me, it's important to participate. And that was exactly it. So there they are. They ask you 3 things. They want you to sail your best. They want you to tell them what it's like at sea while you're at sea and they're stuck on land. And they want you to come home safely. School kids all over the place. I particularly like this girl here. She's got the mic boom there, the sound girl. Really intent on her job. And the legends of the sport are on the dock as well. Yves Parlier, who had led the race in '96 and broke his mast in the Indian Ocean, made one of the greatest repairs I've ever could ever imagine. Sailed the boat in a jury rig to an island south of New Zealand, went in, anchored, set about repairing the mast, cut the 2 pieces down so that he could, and then he rejoined them with carbon and epoxy at anchor in this island south of New Zealand, and then re-stepped the mast by himself. It was a 58-foot mast at anchor. And then he sailed across the Pacific, around Cape Horn, up the Atlantic, and finished officially, having received no help. Ellen MacArthur, who was second in the 2000 race, was on the dock too there. You can see her giving encouragement to Johnny Malbon. This was Michel Desjoyeau's right-hand man, Jean-Philippe Guillemot, and probably the most sophisticated technically on the dock there in Les Sables d'Olonne for that period of time, for those couple of weeks. And you might think that he'd say, Rich, is your desalinator making enough fresh water? Or you got a good signal from the wind instruments at the top of the mast? Something technical. Wasn't that at all. It was, Rich, we will be stuck on land. You will be at sea. You must tell us what it's like. You must tell us of the cold and the gales and the birds in the south. You have to tell us these things. It was almost imploring me. It was really a remarkable attitude. We loaded all the food on board. The target was 6,000 calories a day, 4 full meals a day, every 6 hours, snack between meals, eat, drink. And that's like task number 1 on the job list every day. Now, this is, the fleet gets towed out through the channel to the start. 300,000 people came to line the channel banks that day. You can see it there. It was just unbelievable. and probably half the skippers by the time you get out to the Atlantic Ocean were really crying. It was so emotional. They knew that probably half the fleet wouldn't finish the race. Skippers might not come home from this, and they wanted you to know as you headed off to circle the world that they were on your side. I like that guy in the water to get a little closer picture. The fleet headed off, 30 boats, 20 brand new boats, fully budgeted, just like NASCAR teams. You can see that the Europeans have figured out that this is a good sport to sponsor. Of the 20, well, let's see, 20 brand new boats, there were 4 boats from the 2004 generation that were still competitive, and 6 of us were the older boats. 17 French, 7 English, 2 Swiss, Canadian, an Austrian, Spanish guy, and me. Here we go. Great American 3 heading off. sitesALIVE, 1 reef in the main at this point. You can see how that windward rudder is up and out of the water. And we had had 3 weeks of glorious weather in Les Salles alone. But when the race day started, it was cold and raining and windy, and there was a big storm forecast for that first weekend. And so the fleet heads off into this. It's blowing out of the southwest. Got to get to the southwest to get to Cape Finisterre. The storm hit the fleet, and there was disaster in the fleet. There were 3 broken masts, and Hugo Boss here just started to totally delaminate the hull structure with the pounding going upwind. And you think about this, these boats are 18 to 20 feet wide, but the hull is only about 18 inches deep. So they're basically flat bottom. It's like sailing a 60-foot laser. They do not like to sail upwind. It's bang, 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 as they pound. And that's what happened to Hugo Boss, just crushed the carbon laminate. And this was the red boat we saw earlier in the video. Broken mast, brand new boat as well, broken mast, older boat, broken mast. 5 other boats having to go back for repairs. Devastation for the fleet, including Michel Desjoyeaux there in the center, who had a problem. Now, you can go back and repair the boat and leave again in 10 days if you can get it squared away. And so a little bit more about Michel, because I had seen him on the dock after I finished the qualification race back from Brazil. And I asked him in my best high school French from 40 years before if I could send him some questions about how to sail these boats. And he really appreciated the fact that I was trying to speak to him in French. And he said yes, and it's okay to send them in English. Anyway, I got back to the U.S. and I decided, because of my respect for Michel, to in fact send them in French. So it took me about a day to type out 10 detailed questions. Sent them off. 24 hours later, I got 10 detailed answers in English. And they prompted clarification questions for me, so I sent those back in French again. 24 hours later, again, in English, answers back from Michel Desjoyeaux. This went on for about 6 or 7 exchanges back and forth, 4,000 word email exchange about all sorts of things. And one of the things that he sent me was this was a sail selection chart for wind velocity and direction relative to the boat, and what sails he would have and when he would reef and so forth. And what I like is down in here, I think it is, I can't quite see it, is where he will set his 5,000 square foot spinnaker in up to 27 knots true when he's alone. And so I always thought that made some of the America's Cup stuff look a little silly when they wouldn't leave the dock with 17 guys on board if it was blowing 22. Anyway, Michel is great. His nickname was Le Professeur for his wide knowledge and willingness to share it, as he showed. Very generous. Now here's a video aboard Foncia. It's Michel's boat. He has these deck spreaders, they're called. That's what holds the mast up instead of spreaders on the mast. Allows for a little bit less compression on the mast, as he has a rotating wing mast. Going along with his staysail there, upwind. See, making pretty good time, and you get a feeling for, we go over a couple of these waves, the sort of the bit of the pounding that the flat bottom gives, and just that jarring is. Now Michel says he doesn't like to get wet, so he has this big sliding hatch, comes back over the cockpit. He's only got 4 winches in the cockpit. There he is sitting in his little bubble, sitting there nice and dry, hand steer. Going along. He won the race in 2000. He's won every other solo transatlantic race that there is.
He's got the autopilot right there. Slide away that nice telescoping tiller, get it out of the way, make a little more room in the cockpit, and take a look around. No waves breaking over his head, kind of a nice thing. And that's a wireless autopilot control that he developed with NKE. Sits on his wrist, so from the top of the mast, the bow, the stern, he can adjust the autopilot. That's his chart table, that's his dining room table, that's where he sleeps, that one seat. There is no chart table on that boat. Everything to save weight. Anyway, he's going along. You can see he can make a lot of miles in 24 hours if you're going this fast. But he's great, and we knew that when he had to go back, he would be back on the course pretty soon and be back at it. Now, so one of the things that happened in that big storm, we got through it okay, or the boat got through it okay, but I didn't get through it okay. Big wave hit the boat. I got thrown across the cabin inside. Went about 6 or 7 feet in midair, and was twisting in the midair, and it was one of those things where your brain knows what's about to happen, but they can't do anything about it. And so I hit a grab bar in one of those longitudinal bulkheads, went through a hole in that bulkhead underneath the bunk, hit one-point landing just off my spine, jackknifed me, or chest to knees, went through, fetched up on the inside of the boat in agony, and didn't know what had happened, thought maybe, who knew, maybe it was paralyzed, something. Sort of scrambled, tried the toes, the fingers, make sure everything's still working, was able to climb out of there, extreme pain, wasn't able to, in fact, reach across the chart table to get to the satellite telephone to call Dr. Barnywalt back in Boston for about 10 hours. Really painful. But anyway, finally did get through to Brian Barnywalt and talked it through. He thought, well, it probably broke 1 or 2 ribs. Nothing to do for it. Want to make sure you haven't punctured a lung, so keep tabs on that. I said, look, I'm a pretty good observer of my lung function for the asthma. I think it's okay. It just hurts to breathe in and out. So we continued along. Over the next couple of days, take an ibuprofen basically for that. But managing these boats is really a handful. Our boats are big, and the sails are big, and the loads are big. But we did get down, kept going, got down past the Canary Islands. And I feel so strongly that, this race is just one of the great races, if not the greatest ocean race. And we finally got going. We were going downwind, kind of broad reaching, 15 knots of wind. You got to set the spinnaker. I mean, you got to do it out of respect for the race, respect for the competitors, all those people who've sailed the race before. So we got down past the Canary Islands, time to set the spinnaker, despite the pain in the ribs. It's a masthead spinnaker, and did do it. This is a boat called Saffron, nice little fractional spinnaker, actually. I got the spinnaker up about midnight, and we're going along pretty nicely, 15 knots of wind. And then the breeze started to pick up, and of course this has happened to everybody in the room, and this started to happen to us, and it kept happening, and you sort of square the boat away, and the breeze kept getting stronger and stronger. It got up to about 24 knots of wind, and we just kept broaching like this, and then of course you have to get it down. And that's when you lean into the cabin and you say, if anybody would like to come up and help, this would be a good time. And there's never any answer. So you struggle with it, and you get the thing down eventually and continue along. As we headed down towards Cape Verde, along the African coast there, then down towards the equator, there's much emotion in this all the way along. And my friend Scott Hamilton, who had been to Everest, had given us these prayer flags from Nepal, blessed by the monks, to fly. And this was a flag hand-painted by the Jackson School in Newton, and this was actually the Chanel scarf, which was we had a lady who worked with us at sitesALIVE who died a year before the race from brain tumor, and her husband, Larry, had wanted me to fly Cindy's favorite scarf. So I flew it as we entered King Neptune's new domain. And we've had a tradition also at sea for all of our voyages of flying a new U.S. yacht ensign every day at sea. And the idea here is that then I will mark in the margin the name of the boat, the date, latitude and longitude of the noon position. Then we have live memorabilia to give to people. And these have been proven to be pretty popular, so this was a nice thing. So I climb out there every day, tie a new one on. Down to the equator, the dolphins, they're accustomed to playing in the bow wave, but there's no bow wave today. So you can just tell they're all like, what's going on here? Can this guy like pick up the pace at some point? This huge flying fish came aboard, biggest one I've ever seen. And one of the dangers there is that if you ever got hit in the eye with one of those, it would put your eye out because they're moving pretty fast, and something that's that big is pretty heavy. And the double rainbow is nice, except for it probably also means there's a 40-knot squall over there. So anyway, we continue along. The fleet had the lead pack of the 20 brand new boats. There were about 10 boats that had pulled out into a pretty tight pack, about 100 miles by 100 miles up at the front, and they were going really fast. Then there was kind of a disparate second group, and then we were in a third group, which was exactly to be expected. Now, the school program, of course, has been going on through all of this, and I spend about 2 hours a day on that, and that's not just a responsibility, but it's really a privilege to be able to make a voyage, do something beyond just the sailboat race for myself. So what would happen here, these were weeks 1 through 4, I would write the lead piece each week. This was on a topic coordinated with our teacher's guide that had been written by teachers. Then on a rotating basis, each of our team of experts would write a piece. So the kids got to hear from this incredible array of experts. And you know, for young students, you never know what's going to catch them. And you're just trying to give them as much as you can possibly give them. Maybe something will catch their interest. That's the goal. We're also doing audio reports every day, ship's log, ship's journal, photos, videos, Q&A through the website 3 times a week, and then this formal essay. And the formal essay, if you get a chance to write for 25 newspapers, you know, you don't send them your first draft or your 5th draft. You send them about your 8th draft because you have this really unique opportunity. So you want to make that as good as you can. In the South Atlantic, we got word that through Neil that there was something going on in Missouri. He said, Don called, it seems like there's a lot of activity out there, a lot of newspapers downloading the PDF files. I said, well, are they actually publishing it or are they just attaching it to their website? And so he found out we had 25 extra newspapers in the state of Missouri publishing the series, in addition to the 25 that we had contracts with. So the notion for many people in the U.S. media and potential corporate sponsors that, you know, it's only going to be of interest to New Bedford or Marblehead or San Francisco is absolute baloney. And here they were, 1,000 miles from salt water and following a French yacht race, but we had 25 newspapers in the state of Missouri publishing our series. That was amazing. Across the South Atlantic, get a feel for what it's like on board the boat. Got staysail and probably 2 reefs in the main here. Pretty reasonable day, cloudy, cold, but not too bad, making some good time. At about this time, 25 days in, the ribs were starting to feel better. It's usually about 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So that agony's diminished, which is good. Now, along the way, I would make, on average, 5 to 7 sail changes every day. Those would be reefs or going between jibs. And what it amounted to on the pedestal winch was between 3,000 and 5,000 revolutions under load. And just an incredible effort, really, to do that. The physical aspect of sailing these boats, they're about the same size, if not a little bit bigger than the 12 meters, but you don't have all the extra guys and you don't come in for lunch. And so you're making all these sail changes, you know, in heavy weather and so forth too. Now, Marty Shea, who was my trainer, she was really extraordinary, and she got me into the best physical condition of my life, not just relative to age, but absolutely. And one of the things that happens at sea is, you know, despite how strong you might be, you're going to get stronger and stronger up top, or your muscles will. But your legs will atrophy because they're just bracing you all the time. And so Marty had these special sort of torture exercises for that, where she would make me hold 2 20-pound dumbbells up here to destabilize me up high, then do sets of one-legged deep knee bends, and on a trampoline. So that would bring all of your muscles into play. It was pretty amazing, but she got me into great shape. For the skippers over 40 years old, you had to take a cardiac stress test on the Bruce protocol, which is the accelerating treadmill with the incline going up slowly. And when I did that, I did almost 15 minutes, and I asked the nurse, for what age is that the average? And she looked it up, and she said, 29. So that's pretty good. I was asthmatic, 58-year-old, the same level as a 29-year-old. So it either meant I was in great shape or the 29-year-olds of the world had a lot of work to do. So we come down through the South Atlantic. These are ice gates. There were pairs of waypoints across the south. You had to be north of that line at some point, even if only for 10 seconds. And that line, and the idea was to keep the fleet away from where the icebergs were breaking off from Antarctica. So we made this nice big arcing curve there towards that first ice gate. And one of the things I'd done was I'd studied with Jean-Yves Bernot, who was the guru of the great French weather routers, for a week, one-on-one, 8 hours a day, the summer before, or about 3 months before the race started. And we went through ocean region by ocean region, and what were the likely scenarios that we would encounter along the way. This guy had answers to questions I wouldn't have imagined to have asked. He was amazing. And one of the things that distinguished him was that he had actually raced around the world twice himself. So he had real-world experience of this. He wasn't just sitting in the office. And we had a computer program that would take the GRIB files, which are forecasts of weather, and combine those with the performance polars of the boat, and would estimate where it thought you should be going. And so every skipper was doing this for hours and hours every day, because anything you could gain by brain versus brawn on deck was really desirable. And so what you do is you go through scenarios like this, and then you might say, okay, jibing this boat takes a half an hour, and it's risky, so you might take a couple of those out because these legs aren't really that long. So you might do just a couple of those jibes, so you apply a little bit subjective judgment to it to get to where you're going. Into the Indian Ocean, our first gale in that ocean. You can see here, actually a pretty nice sunny day, blowing about 40 at this point. Seas starting to get up a little bit, and we're going along with just 3 reefs in the main, no jib at all, and that turned out to be a big mistake, because later that night, when it got up to over 60 knots of wind, we were hitting 22, 23 knots with just 3 reefs in the main, and there's no way to get it down because it's blowing up against the rigging and the mast, and the only way to get it down is to have a jib up, so then sail upwind into this gale, and then the mainsail will flag away from the mast and you'll be able to drop it. But I didn't have the storm jib up, which had been the plan, but I thought, well, the boat seems to be going along nicely here, no need to have the storm jib up. Big mistake. So instead of setting it in 40 knots of wind in the daytime, I had to set it in 60 knots of wind in the nighttime. I got whacked in the head really hard by the sheet flailing in the 60 knots of wind. Knocked me right to my knees at the mast. Determined from then on that I would wear a helmet that we have specifically for going aloft with a full Lexan visor every time I was on deck after that. And there's a picture of the helmet. Got the balaclava on underneath it. And you can see the nosedive and the barograph here for that first gale. Of course, we got through that. Things got a little bit better. And then about a day and a half later, second gale hit. About the same amount of wind, and we were in the Indian Ocean for sure. Now, things happening up ahead as well. Loic Peyron, one of the great French sailors, was leading the race. He led the race all the way through the Atlantic. Just an amazing effort. At every position report for 14 days in a row, he was in the lead. In the Indian Ocean, he went aloft to retrieve a halyard that had lost. The next day, his mast exploded and came down. And nobody was untoward enough to pose the question, what would have happened if he'd been up there when that exploded? Mike Golding took over the lead. He was in second place at the time, was in first place, going along. Squall hit the boat. Boat took off at 32 knots of wind, and his mast exploded as well. So those two leaders out of the race. This was Mike's 8th race around the world. A number of my American friends had said, you're going to do great. Like, you've done all these clipper voyages, long distance sailing. But the level of experience of this fleet, particularly the really senior French guys, is pretty amazing. How many miles they've spent at sea. So we get going here in between gales. One of the great things about the south there is the albatross are with you all the time. Here's one flying around. They're great. They just soar. They sort of never seem to flap their wings very much. And looking for squid that might be turned up in the wake of the boat. And going along one day, I was standing in the cabin watching the instruments, watching the computer screen. Suddenly there was this huge crash, and I just ducked. And I kind of looked up. I thought the mast, that maybe it was just coming through the cabin top or something happened. And there's this albatross on the middeck. It crashed into the boat somehow. And you think, did this albatross make an aerodynamic miscalculation? How could this be? But probably got confused by the turbulence behind the sails. And he was kind of all over the place trying to get off the boat. And he got up, fell through the lifelines, fell into the water, and then kind of ran off, flapping his wings, and got aloft again. Not sure who was more surprised at that. School program has continued along here, and weeks 5 through 8 with our different experts as well writing. And this was really a great thing. This gave me a lot of motivation, I got to say, that we were able to have this kind of an impact. We ended up having about 250,000 school kids across the U.S. through the 50 newspapers and online, and students in about 15 countries through the website as well. Put a couple of other things in here just for sort of the environment of sailing the boat. The iPod is in there. Music can really help you one way or the other. If you got to go make a big sail change, you might listen to some Bruce Springsteen before you set the spinnaker. But if you're in the gales of the south where it's blowing 60, and that second gale was even more violent, it seemed, and it was bringing the air right up from Antarctica. It was so cold. I almost always forget to talk about the cold when I give talks because it just became background noise. It's like if you're just living outdoors for this period of time across the south. It was unbelievably cold. You go forward, put up the storm jib, you come back, and you can't move your fingers or your hands. They're just sort of frozen. So in the gales of the south, you might listen to some classical music to try to tone down the fear. And a friend had given me a CD of St. Benedictine monk chants. And there was one night that I listened to this 4 times, 72 chants in a row. And try to calm down the fear that's going on. It was very helpful. Now, a big episode happening up ahead in the lead pack. Jan Elias, one of the young great sailors, had been on the bowsprit of the boat, making about 12 to 14 knots. He was re-leading a line out to the tip of the bowsprit. Boat took off down a sea, buried the bow in the next trough at about 22 knots of speed, crushed him against the bow pulpit, broke his tether. He ended up outside the boat, holding on with one hand to the bow pulpit. Got himself somehow back on the boat. I don't know how you do that even at the dock, let alone where he was, or those injuries. Extreme pain. Got himself back on deck somehow, back down the deck into the cockpit, into the cabin, was able to call for help to the race office, let them know what had happened. They immediately contacted the Australian Navy, that sent out a frigate from Perth to get there in 2 days' time. As well, they contacted the 2 closest boats. Mark Guillemot, who was in that gray boat, we saw the spinnaker earlier, was about 50 miles ahead of Jan. He stopped racing, turned around and sailed back. And Samantha Davies, who was about 400 miles away, was directed to go to the site as well. And she stopped racing and immediately headed there with a brief from the race doctor to lend emotional support. And Mark got there. He started sailing past. Jan could not reach his severe pain medication. It was 6 feet away. So Mark would sail by, mixed up his pain medication in plastic water bottles, try to lob it down the companionway. And there's nobody on the Red Sox that could do that. So anyway, it didn't work, but just having him there was good. And 2 days later, the Australians got there and were able to take him off. Turned out he had a broken thigh bone, pelvis, and back. He was operated on in Perth and flew home to France, and they had to let the boat go. 800 miles south of Australia, not a big trade route, so not a lot of ships down there. But anyway, that was really too bad. But it gave pause to everybody in the fleet. Everybody, you could just tell that there was kind of a chill through the skippers to be more careful about everything. For my part, when I got there to about that same area, I finally was able to get into the bunk. We had 2 bunks on each side of the boat. Was able to get into those in the Indian Ocean. Hadn't been able to get into a bunk all the way through the Atlantic because of the ribs. And got launched out of that bunk, went about the same 6 or 7 feet across the cabin, and landed a one-point landing on my eyebrow on the floor. And of course, you know, it's a sailboat, so the floor is painted with non-skid paint. And so I got up and sort of top my head. That seemed okay. And that seemed okay. It was, of course, 2 o'clock in the morning. Nothing ever happens in the daylight. You know, and then this hand came away wet. And turned on the light, looked at my hand, it was completely bloody. Looked in the mirror, this whole side of my face was bloody. And I thought momentarily about taking a picture of this to send into the American media that thinks sailing such a sissy sport. But anyway, decided it might be more prudent, since I couldn't see out of that eye, to try to clean it up and find out what was underneath it. So I was able to do that, took the picture, sent it in to Brian. I called him, we chatted about it, tried to get some tape on it. I said, you know, better to not try to stitch it or staple it, so try to get some tape across it. I got that piece of tape across it, sent that in to him and also Jean-Yves Chauve, the official French race doctor, and basically got 2 job offers. I said, you know, if you can be that meticulous in those conditions, we can always use that in the emergency room when you get back. So it was good. Across the south, we went north of the Kerguelen Islands here, although the Great Circle route was to the south. Murray Lister, the captain of the New Zealand container ship, had been on our New York to Melbourne voyage. I'd contacted him. He was coming out of the Persian Gulf on a container ship, and I described the beautiful route that the clipper ship Mandarin had made going New York to Melbourne and going south of the Kerguelen Islands. And he said, we would have never considered taking New Zealand Pacific at 815 feet long south of Kerguelen Islands. It's just too dangerous. So that was good enough for me. I stayed north. There were a bunch of the other boats did, although probably half the fleet went south and on to the West Australian ice gate. So our group going into the Indian Ocean, our sort of third group of the fleet, was 5 boats. We lost the Spanish skipper with a broken rudder off South Africa. In that second gale, one of the boats kept going straight up into it. I'd kind of made a detour to get on the downwind side of that new system as it came along. And he got hammered and autopilot failure, rigging failure, and he had to drop out. So we were down to 3 in our group. And Derek Hatfield, a Canadian, was behind me about 100 miles. I called him one day because we had an anomalous reading on the automatic identification system, which will take ships at sea and put them on your computer screen. So I'm not sure if there's a ship here. There may be, but you're about on my track. Be on high alert when you come through here. And he said, have you heard? And I said, no, heard what? And he said, well, last night in that last gale, we got rolled upside down. The mast was underwater. And when it came back upright, the top 2 spreaders on the port side were broken. And Derek was just disconsolate. He had raised all the money and small donations to build the boat, built it himself. This was his big effort, and he was going to be out of the race. So I called him back the next day and read him this great quote from Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena quote, and said, you know, Derek, you're the man in the arena. No reason to be ashamed. You did a great job, represented Canada well, the race well, yourself well, you know, and you'll be back. And as just as Samantha and Mark had gone physically to the proximity of Jan, this was what I could do for Derek. I called him every day till he got to Tasmania just to check in with him and try to buoy his spirits a little bit. So the tradition of the sea, go to the aid of a mariner in distress in whatever way you can. Now, here's other sailors. So you can see the cold here in the south. Dominic Wavre, his 8th race around the world also. Armel Lecléache, saw his boat being rewrited in the beginning. There's Michel Desjoyeaux, who had just streaked down through the Atlantic, closing on the lead pack, got into the South Atlantic. He was at the tail end of that lead pack. He'd caught up about 2 days. It was really remarkable. And you could tell from the chatter coming from the other sailors in that pack that Michel was coming. You know, and there was talk about we're pushing too fast, the boats are going to break, but Michel was coming, and so they had to push hard. And the boats did start to break. There were other boats that broke as well. Now, there are a couple of British women in the race. Dee Ferry, she's had a great attitude. This was her mainsail, brand new boat, one of the 20. Mainsail totally delaminating. And but what a great attitude. See, the Vendee Globe, not such a big deal. You start, you turn left, Cape of Good Hope, check, Cape Lewin, check, Cape Horn, check, and you continue along. So I can tell you that managing these boats is just a huge physical effort. And if you have something extra to do, like trying to deal with this, it's really incomprehensible what kind of a load that's going to be. I guess it was in the North Atlantic. I had to lower the mainsail all the way. We had a little bit of a twist aloft on the main halyard. 1,500 revolutions on the pedestal winch to hoist that mainsail from the boom up to the top of the mast. So if you have to keep lowering this thing to try to fix it, it's just a monumental effort. And Dee was big and strong, but still, monumental effort. And she was the first woman to sail around the world solo, nonstop, upwind, and wanted to become the first to sail both directions. So she persevered. Samantha Davies was the one who had gone also to the vicinity of Jan Elias. Samantha was a force of nature. Always going fast, always on top of the world. Love this picture here with the stuffed animals. Just too scary out there in the south. She had her Eat Your Greens going, and this was a Christmas. Now, when we got south of New Zealand, after Derek dropped out, it was only Johnny Malbin up ahead of me and us in our group. There were 2 boats about 1,000 miles back. And when we got there, Johnny started talking about dropping out. Now, he and I had struck up a really nice iridium friendship. We talked almost every day. Early in the Indian Ocean, he'd called to say he'd seen an iceberg. I was approximately behind him, so I should be on high alert when I got there. So we ended up chatting almost every day, and it was nice to have somebody out there who was getting hammered as well, sort of as a brother in arms. So when we got there, Johnny had a mainsail built by the same manufacturer as Dee's mainsail, an unnamed sailmaker. And his was falling apart the same way. And so he started talking about dropping out because he didn't think he had enough fuel on board to be able to generate electricity at a slower speed to power all the electronics and so forth and autopilots all the way back to France. So I tried to talk him out of it, and for 2 reasons. Altruistically, both for him and for me. So Johnny, look, we'll be 5,000 miles to Cape Horn. If we get there okay, we'll be around, we'll be along the coast, then you can drop out any time. But maybe you can nurse the boat home and finish. After the episode with Jan, there was a lot of talk in the pack about just finishing. There was only a couple of boats at the front who could win this race at this point, so people were just talking about finishing. For me, it was if Johnny dropped out, the next boat ahead of me was going to be 900 miles ahead of me. Next boat behind me was 1,000 miles behind me. If I got into the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 5,000 miles across, and what happened to Jan happened to me, it would be a week before anybody got there. So I was pretty leery of that. Turned out Johnny decided to drop out. He pulled out, went to Auckland, and I headed out into the Pacific alone. Pretty anxious. About 2 days into this, I got an email from Samantha up ahead of me. She said, "Hi, Rich. I see you've lost your last running mate from your group. It won't be much fun to sail the Pacific alone, so I'll be your virtual running mate, and I'll check in with you every couple of days." And I can't tell you how much that meant to me, to have a competitor out there who was observing that going on behind them and was the tradition of the sea again, doing what she could do to help me behind her, but still a competitor in the race. So she did check in across the Pacific, and it was a great thing. I put this picture in just as a reminder that 14,000 of the 28,000 miles are sailed in the dark of night. And so everything you do in the daytime, you got to be able to do at night as well. We get to the international date line here, halfway around the world. The Bounty Islands were discovered by Captain Bligh. Took these two pictures as we went across, 179.59 east and 179.59 west. Kind of a nice pair of pictures. And if you're going to take a picture of the GPS, it's good if you're going fast. Nobody thinks that you're dawdling. So heading across into the Pacific, 3 more ice gates in the Pacific, and we ran into a big storm, the only named storm in the Vendee Globe, and we got it. The tropical storm Hedda, it had been way to the north before, and then sort of, I guess it's going this way, had gone down to the southwest, to the south, looked like it was going to reorganize, it did, and started to come back to the southeast, planning to meet us basically at the middle ice gate in the Pacific. Here, these are wave height forecast maps, and you can see the wave height starting to get up here as this thing reforms to come down into the deep south. So tried to figure out a plan for that. The idea was I would sail up to the West Pacific ice gate, had to touch that ice gate, and then I'd jibe away immediately, let this thing go down in front of me, and then I could tuck in behind it to get over to the East Pacific ice gate. Really good plan, didn't work out that way at all. The thing got up here, just stopped, and started to spin off secondary lows in front of me, but the bulk of the storm just was there. And so eventually had to bite the bullet, sail up into the middle of it, and then go across the East Pacific ice gate, and then head down to Cape Horn. Now, when you get to here, you'd really like to have this section be fairly moderate, so that you can eat more, sleep more, make sure all the repairs on the boat are taken care of, everything's good before you get to Cape Horn. And I had sort of special knowledge about what could happen there. That didn't turn out that way either. We had several episodes along here, one of which was that there was the 3 running backstays that go to the stern. They have a piece of bungee cord that goes around the mast. And so when one of them's pulled up tight and the lured ones are slack, the bungee cord pulls those forward and organizes them. That had stretched and degraded, I guess, in the sunlight, and so I discovered that one of those running backstays was hooked around the top spreader, couldn't get it off. And if I ground that in and jibed, it would break off that spreader, and then the mast would come down. So I eventually was able to get it unhooked, then I have to try to figure out, what do I do now? Either I do not make that mistake all the way back to France, which is about another 9,000 miles, or I've got to go aloft and cut that bungee cord. So eventually we had a reasonable day. This was the maneuver on board that I had dreaded ever since I even began to think about going on this race, to have to go aloft on your own on an open 60. Hoisted 3 lines to the top of the mast, made 2 of them as tight as I could to the deck. I had the hiking boots just like these on board for specifically this task. Had these foot ascenders, they're called, lashed those on. Had a paraglider's harness from a French Army paratrooper, sort of a full body harness. I could put a carabiner up high, and then I could try to walk up these 2 lines. This was the descent line, the Gree descender. Now, I'm not a mountain climber, but this was going to be the rig to go up. Brian Thompson, who was in the race, had said he'd gone aloft halfway up the mast and got stuck. He couldn't come down because his 2 ropes were different stretchiness, and when he switched to the descent line, he couldn't get the Jumar off the ascent line. So when I got this all set up, I went up about 8 feet and then came down to make sure I could. And then went up another 15 feet, came down and made a few adjustments. Then time to go, went at it and was able to get up. Took about a half an hour to get up to the second spreader where the bungee cord was. Cut the bungee cord, came down, and by the time I got down, I couldn't really move this whole hand because I was trying to control this to not slide all the way at once. Desperately tired at the bottom of that. Ended up drinking an entire quart of Gatorade in basically one gulp. Sweating. I had knee pads on, elbow pads, helmet, because you're going to end up swinging into the mast regardless. It's just going to happen, and I did, bang, 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 and you're trying to protect yourself to not break anything, but was able to do it. Joined a kind of a unique club. Up ahead, another big episode happening at Cape Horn. Jean Le Cam, one of the magical French sailors, was in third place at the time, going along, hit something going fast, and you can see there's no bulb left on that keel fin. Boat capsized immediately. The next boat behind was Vincent Rieu. He got there in about 12 hours, started to circle. I didn't know whether Jean was okay inside. He'd set off an EPIRB, so they knew he was alive, but didn't know if he was injured. Eventually, he came out of there's a hatch in the transom. He came out in a survival suit, climbed on the bottom of the boat, tied himself between the two rudders, and Vincent sailed his boat over to try to throw a line to him. And he came by the first time, threw the line, didn't get to him, had to circle, and so that's a tack and a jibe to get back to the same position. Again, maneuvering these boats is a monster effort. And he was able to do that, came by the second time, threw the line again, didn't get to him, went around a third time, threw the line again, didn't get it to him. Fourth time, getting desperate. These two guys grew up together sailing, went desperately close, got the line to Jean the fourth time. Jean tied it around himself, jumped in the water. Vincent winches him across to his boat, climbs on board, big hug in the cockpit. Then they see that Vincent's deck spreader, carbon tube, had hit the fin of the overturned boat, cracked the carbon tube, and the next day Vincent's mast broke and came down. Vincent Rieu was the defending champion from 2004. He had sacrificed his race to save his friend. Remarkable story. What a momentous occasion that is for everybody in the race to get past Cape Horn. Day 78, tired. One of the things Jean-Yves Bernot had said was, he had sayings about a variety of things, but one of them was, when you get to Cape Horn, you will be tired and the boat will be tired. And that was exactly true. You know, you're getting 4 hours, maybe 5 hours of sleep in 24. You start out with sort of 90-minute naps. That gets down to 30-minute naps, 20-minute naps, and you're just really tired. And the physicality of it, just a huge effort. So, but still, it's a great thing to get around there. You're thinking, okay, we're finally going to be out of the south, going to be in the lee of the South American continent. This is going to be great. Came around the corner, and this was what was facing us. This huge storm coming out of southern Brazil. And here again, there's these wave height forecast maps, and red is really bad. You can see it's sort of 30-foot seas. And we got up into that, sailed directly into it. Here you can see the barograph taking this huge nosedive through that storm. I decided we still had this huge gap, about 1,000 miles in front and behind to the next boats. No reason for any bravado here, so might as well take a little bit of a detour, get on the proper side of this. So I tacked across to get on the downwind side of this thing as it hit. We had sort of 25 to 30 foot seas blowing over 50 knots. Again, down to 3 reefs in the main and the storm jib. And another thing that I really dreaded happened in this. You have that canting keel. The keel was all the way on the port side. We're going along on the port jibe. Boat took off down a sea at the highest speed of the whole race, over hit 24.5 knots. Started to carve a turn to starboard, and we crash jibed in this huge sea. And so now the mainsail's on the wrong side. It breaks the preventer fuse. The main boom crashes across into the running backstays. And you think that running backstay is absolutely loaded. And the trigonometry of that is if you put a big force into something that's already totally loaded, it puts almost an infinite load on it. The mast could easily come down. It didn't, but the keel's on the wrong side. The boat ended up laying over on its side, about 70 degrees of heel, and just sat there. So now you're walking on the side of the walls of the cabin. I went out into the cockpit. We actually we had a protocol for how to try to get out of this mess. We'd never had it happen in those conditions or alone. So the idea is, you think about that picture when the boat's lying on the side for the test. One of the rudders is waving around about 10 feet up in the air. It's not doing anything. The other rudder is basically at sea level, so it can't turn the boat. So you got to get that keel back to center line, try to get the boat to stand up a little, put that rudder back in, and took about a half an hour. I was able to do that, crash jibe back, hope everything holds. It did, and then had to sail back up into all that to get the mainsail down, and then continue along through the night with just the storm jib with a great sense of relief. But at the same time, getting pretty tired, pretty demoralized, frankly. And a couple of days later, we had autopilot failure. And now there's a lot of things you can kind of try to make do with in this kind of a race, but not the autopilots. If the autopilots go, you're done. Autopilot failed, set up the backup, got that going. You got to sort of reboot computers and so forth, get that going again, and engage that, and nothing. So both autopilots are down. Now what do you do? You know, I can hand steer the boat for 17 hours, but I can't hand steer 7,000 miles back to France. So it took about 5 hours. I was able to actually heave to with this open 60, probably the first time in history that an open 60 has hove to, and then was able to find what was wrong. We had a broken bolt in a mechanical system. I was able to put in a replacement and continue along. But I can tell you I was really discouraged at that point. I was beat up, physically with the injuries. There was another one that happened on that last leg up to Cape Horn where sleeping, dozing at the chart table and those cushions that you saw, I ended up just sort of tipping sideways, pivoted at my hips, fell about a meter straight down, landed square on top of my head, crunched neck severely. I mean, it still hurts now. It was 3 years ago. And I got up, didn't break anything, fortunately. Had another conversation with Brian Barney-Walt, went through all the stuff, tingling in your fingers, tingling in your toes. It seems okay. And I said to him, now this could have turned out a lot worse, right? And he said, well, actually, the human body can take about a 1 meter fall directly on top of your head if everything's lined up properly. So I said, well, I guess it's good I lined everything up then. He said, yeah, well, it's good. Well done. Anyway, continue along, but pretty discouraged. Now, this cartoon we've had at the chart table for all of our voyages. And this has to be the default philosophy of any Vendee Globe skipper. Just never give up. You're going to keep going until you're so broken or the boat's so broken that you have to stop. But anyway, that usually puts a smile on my face, but even in these dark circumstances, sometimes it doesn't quite. But I wasn't the only one having problems. This was Roland Jourdain. He was in second place, going around Cape Horn to Michel Desjoyeaux, who had caught up with the pack, gone through the pack in the Indian Ocean, taken the lead in the Pacific, as a number of other boats in that lead pack broke and had to drop out. Michel had taken the lead, and Roland Jourdain was about a day and a half behind him. He hit something going fast also, and it cracked the bulkheads that held his keel on. He made this amazing repair at sea. You can see he's a real favorite of the French, and particularly French school kids. They love him. He's got a great sense of humor. So he ground off all the paint off the bulkhead. He had this carbon plate. You can see he nicely through-bolted all the carbon plate to stabilize that bulkhead, put epoxy in there, laminated the whole thing to stabilize the keel, sailed all the way up through the South Atlantic, across the equator, into the North Atlantic, all the way just short of the Azores, until finally, big bang, and his keel broke off completely. So he decided better to be prudent than any bravado, and he stopped in the Azores. He sailed 27,000 miles and then had to drop out of the race. One of the things that the French did that was great was this radio vacances. They had a French-speaking and an English-speaking radio announcer, and every couple of days they would call every skipper in the fleet. It wasn't just the lead pack, because everybody had a story going on. This was the English-speaking guy, Andy Robertson, who was a Scot. And he became a real friend through the Iridium satellite telephone. You know, he remembered about your eye, he remembered about your neck, he remembered about the autopilot failure and the crash jibe. You know, how's the boat doing? How are you doing? And he really was on your side. He was your friend, and he wanted you to do well and come home and tell him the stories, and that was it. It was really remarkable and hugely encouraging all the while. You know, you're sailing for yourself, for your team. We're sailing for our school kids and all the newspaper readers that we're reaching. You're also sailing for the French public, and it was so encouraging all the way along. The sleep issue at this point is really catching up with you. And a little bit about that. We had a project going on with MIT, actually, where we had some graduate students who were going to actually get credit for analyzing my sleep. Now, this thing is called an ActiWatch. It has an accelerometer in it, and it will record when you're asleep. I used that in the transatlantic race in '04, and I had pretty good confidence in the data, in fact. But this had failed about 3 weeks into the race. So we didn't get any data. Not only the students didn't get any data, but I didn't get the data either to know how much sleep I was really getting. But here's an example. This is from the Transat race in '04, where the yellow is daytime, blue is at night. Each of these horizontal lines is a day, and the black is when I would sleep. So you can see how short the sleep naps are. And this accumulated over the course of those 15 days to averaging about 3¼ hours per 24. We had this is an alarm clock called a sonic boom. It's for the hearing impaired, and it has an alarm of 120 decibels. And so I slept through that a couple of times. During the Vendee Globe, I slept twice for 4 hours. Those were the two longest when I slept through the alarm, and basically sort of passing out on the keyboard. Now, in earlier races, I have had hallucinations at sea, and I had kind of one that was sort of a semi-hallucination here where I don't know whether it started whether I was asleep or in between sleep and being awake, but I realized that for some reason I had to download a 20-ton anchor through the satellite telephone to the boat. That's I put that anchor up there, it reminded me of the story. Now, of course, the problem wasn't, and this continued for about 18 hours while I know that I was wide awake, this issue. The problem wasn't that, of course, you can't download an anchor through the satellite telephone. The problem was that our high-speed 56K baud rate satellite telephone had malfunctioned. So all we were left with was the 2.4K baud rate Iridium. So it was going to just take forever to download this anchor through the 2.4K baud rate Iridium. And that went on for about 18 hours. Like, how is this going to, Anyway, that's kind of what's going on. Now, Michel, way up ahead, had sailed through the fleet, sailed away as boats behind him broke. He had problems as well. See, there's sort of a black spot here where his bowsprit started to break off, and he re-carboned it back on. One of his rudders had broken off. He noticed that it was in fairly light conditions, and he had gone right through the lifelines, practically over the side, hooked the lifelines with his feet to grab that rudder before it drifted under the boat. pulled it back on board, scavenged a lifeline stanchion as a new pivot point for the rudder, and kept going. That was unbelievable. So he sailed away with it, winning the Vendee Globe for the second time out of 2 tries. You can see the reception getting there. Next in, about 5 days later, was Armel Leclerc and Brit Air. He had also stood by Jean Le Cam off Cape Horn. He'd been the next boat to arrive after Vincent arrived. And then Mark Guillemot on board Safran. He had a remarkable race. After standing by Jan Elias south of Australia, his mainsail track had started to pull off the mast. It sailed into a small island south of New Zealand, anchored, went aloft, re-drilled the holes, put in bolts with epoxy to try to attach that track to the mast again. Sailed across the Pacific with that. It didn't hold, went around Cape Horn, sailed into Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, anchored again, went up the mast again, made another repair, sailed all the way up the Atlantic with that repair, got past the Azores on the home stretch, 1,000 miles from the finish. His keel broke off entirely. He somehow caught the boat before it capsized, dropped the sails, called in, got his design team, and they did a new calculation. What's the stability of that boat without a keel? They said, if that boat heels 28 degrees, it will tip over. So he sailed the last 1,000 miles holding the main sheet in his hand and keeping that boat upright, and finished the race in 3rd place. They gave Vincent Rieu 3rd place equivalent finish. He'd been in 3rd place when he rescued Jean Le Cam off Cape Horn. And that was exactly the right thing to do. What a great effort there. Next in was Samantha in 4th place. Spectacular effort by her. She had loved every minute of it, even in the gales of the south. She just seemed happy at sea. Brian Thompson, who had got stuck aloft and basically was repairing his boat all the way around the world. Bulkheads were breaking, his alternator broke, making repairs all the way. He came in 5th. Dika Ferry nursed that mainsail around the world to finish in 6th place, becoming the first woman to sail solo nonstop in both directions. Spectacular effort, indefatigable D. For us, continue with the school program. That's top of the list all the time. We had anticipated that I'd be able to finish, perhaps a little optimistically, in 15 weeks. I was still at sea after 15 weeks when the contracts with the newspapers expired. So we didn't have, and that was really a loss of motivation for me in a way, or a loss of sort of impetus to not be able to reach all those people. And so a bit of a downer there, but we'd pulled it off up through that point. We continue with the website. The fleet gets up. You can see the paths of most of the fleet going around the Azores High here. You get up, wrap around, then head in towards France. We got up there. This was us. We got in and that Azores High dissipated completely. There was no wind. We had to head north again, had to make this big detour to get out to the next high-pressure system coming out of Canada. And when that finally got here, we ended up going almost dead downwind. So even after all this time, still not able to head for France. So we're going dead downwind. We get port jibe heading for Norway, starboard jibe heading for Morocco, port jibe heading for Scotland, then for Portugal, and for England. It was just really depressing. I just couldn't head for the finish line. But eventually making progress. At the time, Arnaud Boissiere and Steve White finished 7th and 8th. Steve was the next boat ahead of me in the fleet. They were in sister ships. They finished about 4 or 5 days apart. Great effort by his 2 young sailors. Arnaud is going to be back for the next one as well. When we got up into this northern North Atlantic, this is just an idea of what you're sort of faced with. Okay, so here's a weather map. So you got new storm, developing gale, developing gale, gale. And it's all moving, it's all interacting, and you're trying to pick your way through this thing somehow. This was from a year before when this cargo ship was washed up on the beach in Les Sables d'Olonne, the starting port, by a big storm. Containers that had been knocked off a container ship floating. The race committee sent out this picture. And as we came across here, I was trying to sort of thread our way between this new storm up here and the calm of this high. We were probably in around here. There was a big container ship that we saw overtaking us. And we had this thing where we'd call all the ships and we'd find out where they're coming from, going to, and what they're carrying, add that to the website so kids could get an idea about resource flow around the world and so forth. And we talked with this guy, and 3,000 TEU container ship. Said, Captain, how fast what's the speed are you making? He said, about 18 knots. I said, that seems a little slow for a ship of your size. He says, yes, well, we're waiting for the 35-foot seas at the mouth of the English Channel to go away. You can see this red before we go in there. So we were trying to, as I said, thread our way down there, just outside that big storm to go in. And I put these two lines here across between the Cape Finisterre, northwest corner of Spain, northwest corner of France. These are the two shipping routes, southbound first and then the northbound. Southbound, 5 ships were there. We kind of went in between the third and the fourth. Had to make a little bit of a maneuver to get past there. And then across about 20 miles to get to the next shipping lane. There were 4 ships coming along. 3 of them coming up on the horizon were definitely going to be ahead of us. The 4th one looked a little bit close. So instead of watching from the cabin on the radar, I decided to sit in the cockpit and watch. I was sitting there eating Fig Newtons and stuffing Fig Newtons down. We had supposed to eat a whole sleeve of Fig Newtons every day. It was part of the diet. 825 calories in a sleeve of Fig Newtons, if you're curious. And then suddenly I woke up, and that ship wasn't there anymore. And I jumped up and looked around, and the ship was over there. And I'm about 85% sure it went ahead of us, but not 100% sure. I just couldn't stay awake. So eventually we get in there, coming in, jibed one last time. You can see here that the wind turbine on the stern of the boat has been knocked off in the violence of sailing upwind in the South Atlantic. 3 reefs in the main, and staysail to come in. It's supposed to be blowing harder as we get closer to the finish line. The finish line is only 4/10 of a mile from the beach, so after you cross the finish line, you got to deal with the boat right away and not do a lot of celebrating. But the boat looks pretty good. I was about ready for this to be over, that's for sure. For really the last month of the race, since that storm off Brazil, I was really ready to be finished with this whole thing. So eventually we get there. We come in, cross the finish line. We're in 9th place. And we had arranged this that Hugues Rius was going to come out in the Zodiac with another guy, and they were going to help us get the boat in. Now, the French were just spectacularly welcoming to me through this whole thing, through all of the preparation, just really remarkable. And I only had a little bit of friction with one guy, and that was Terry Dubois, who had built the boat. And you can understand why. Some American comes and thinks he's going to sail the Vendee Globe, takes his baby that he built with his own hands. The first guy on the boat after I crossed the finish line was Terry Dubois. And you can see that smile on his face. He is so happy because this was the first time that his boat had finished officially the Vendee Globe. He was ecstatic. Samantha broke off a PR tour that she was taking around France to come back. She's on one of these Zodiacs out there after our interaction in the Pacific, just to see me come home. Get into the dock. The pontoon is jammed with people. This is the race director, Denis Hero. He had loved our project. He thought it was great. There was American in it. He loved the newspaper program because he always thought that these great French sailboat races should get more exposure, and particularly in the U.S., and so we had been able to do that for the race. They take you immediately up onto a stage to get your absolutely first words and emotions. That was Julian Hawken in the race office. He used to call me on the midnight to 6 a.m. shift to see how things were going wherever I was around the world. What a great feeling.
French weren't fond of our previous president.
Il y a beaucoup de gens, notre troisième président, M. Thomas Jefferson, qui a écrit notre déclaration d'indépendance. Avant qu'il était notre président, il était notre ambassadeur à France. Et dans Paris, il a dit que tous les gens ont deux pays, son pays et la France.
It was Thomas Jefferson, when he was ambassador to France, that said in Paris, all men have two countries, their own and France. The French loved Thomas Jefferson.
Parce que pour moi, cette expérience ici en France était incroyable. Dans le futur, les choses très difficiles sur la mer, les tempêtes, sont perdues de ma mémoire. Je me souviendrai cet autre Vendee Globe, ici, sur la terre, en France, avec vous. Merci.
Yeah, as you can tell, it was heartfelt. And as I said, the French were so encouraging to me that's what I will remember when all of the difficulties at sea are forgotten from the memory. I'll remember being there with them and their encouragement. Take you in for a press conference, there's students around, and in the next couple of days, people come to see the boat, they want to take a picture, ask a question, and there was, I guess it was the next day, there was kind of a group of about 8 to 12 to 20 people kind of all during the course of the day, coming and going. And this one man towards the end of the afternoon was on the dock. He wasn't joining the periphery of the group. He was down the dock a little bit. And when the group disbanded, I walked down to say hello to him. And he started crying when I approached him. So, of course, I started crying too, because I was very emotional. And he was so happy to see one of the boats. He was from Grenoble in the center of France. He was there on business. He'd followed the race, see one of the boats, to meet one of the skippers. And it wasn't at all that I had sailed around the world, he had watched. It was we had done this together. Because the French knew that they had a role to play as well, and the French public on land. And that was to live and breathe every triumph and travail of every skipper at sea. When Jan Elias was hurt, France stopped. And when Jean Le Cam was upside down, France stopped until they were both rescued. So we, humanity, together had sailed around the world. That was what the French thought. The next two boats came in a few days later, Raphael Danelli and Norbert Sedlacek, and you can see there's a real affection, a real camaraderie between the skippers. We'd all gone through something quite extraordinary. We were competitors, but also everybody knew that if something went wrong, that probably somebody who would be able to come and help was one of your competitors. And that's what it was, a real warmth. Came back to the U.S., visited some schools that had followed the race, and that's one of the greatest parts of the whole effort. And then back to France. It turned out that this was the most popular race by every media metric since the race had started, everything up by 50 to 70% over the previous race. And then to Les Sables d'Olonne, this was 10 weeks after the last boat finished for the prize-giving ceremony. Jan Elias had been in a rehab hospital for 4 months, reunion with him. Here's Dika Ferry, finished 6th place, spectacular effort, and just people there. The Vendee Globe book official book was published, so there was a book signing at the local bookstore. Went to that. There were about a dozen of the skippers there. Everybody was back. All the skippers came for the ceremony. Then they take you out to the beach. And the Oscars should go to Les Sables d'Olonne to find out how to put on a show. 120,000 people came to the prize-giving ceremony. Low tide at the beach is the only place they can put the crowd. And so here it is. What a spectacle. And what a privilege to be part of this. The people wanted to participate one more time to sort of see the skippers, salute the skippers, salute the race organizers, salute themselves. There's the 30 skippers back.
It was Michel Desjoyeaux, the winner. Jean Lecombe rescued at Cape Horn. Guy in a suit there. And Vincent Rioux, last one over on the right there, who rescued Jean Lecombe off Cape Horn. Dee and Samantha in the second row. It should have been in the front row. And there's the crowd to welcome everybody back. I'd gone to get a flu shot actually before the whole start of the race, and I had remarked to the doctor how amazing it was. All these people were in Les Sables alone for the start, and he said, "They'll be here when you finish. They'll be here at the prize-giving ceremony." I walked down the barricade to shake hands with everybody that I could, just to thank them one more time in person for their encouragement. And then went back the next day to the book signing again. There was only one skipper there. It was Michel Desjoyeaux, le professeur, mon professeur, who had helped me so much with that extraordinary email exchange before the race. His book was already out and published. And so he'd take the Vendee Globe book, he'd sign it, he'd pass it to me, I'd sign it. Then he started to take his book and sign it and pass that to me also, so I could sign my name underneath his name in his book. And that was a real honor. The French kept asking, when I finished that race, I thought I may never go to sea again. I don't say that to be dramatic. I was really beat up, physically, emotionally, mentally. But the French public were really extraordinary. They kept saying, 2012, 2012, will you be back for 2012? And it really required a sincere response. I started to think, what would it take to do this again? I finally came up with 4 bullet points, which was greatly expanded programs, truly globally, for K-12 education, for asthma, meaning somebody like Glaxo, and seniors, AARP, something like that. And also access to a 2008 generation boat that simply by design and engineering would take 10 days to 2 weeks off that accumulated fatigue curve, which is going exponential at the race, both for the boat and the skipper. You just got to get there sooner. And so we made great progress actually on the 3 programmatic bullet points, but not so much on the finding a financial partner to get access to the boat. So that's highly unlikely to happen. The race starts in 6 months and it's too short. We sailed the boat back up to Port La Forêt in Brittany, where we had prepared the boat, tied her up to the same little finger pier there in a special port built for the open 60s. We were 9th place of 11 finishers of the 30 starters, 121 days at sea, 28,790 miles. Great American 3 was my shipmate. I had guided her, she had defended me in the gales in the south, and finally it was time for us both to have a rest. Well, thanks very much. A few questions. I know it was a long talk. It's a long way around the world. But happy to take any questions if you got any on any part of it all. Yeah.
There was a lot of communication from you to the students. Was there any communication back to you from the students?
Well, they would come out in questions. And then when I get to visit some schools afterwards, you could sort of tell what was going on. Stayed in touch with some of the teachers, some of the newspapers. Some of the newspapers contacted us again after, say, you're going to do that again? We want to do that again. So it's got to be fairly controlled. When we did our very first voyage, the San Francisco to Boston in '93, we were online with Prodigy, and we ended up they were getting 200 questions a week. And so they have to be filtered, otherwise obviously you can't answer all those questions. But what happens is a lot of them they become sort of the same questions. So a lot of people will ask the same kind of question. I don't know if that answers, yeah. Yes?
Where's the boat now?
The boat a year later was sold actually to Derek Hatfield. His boat he'd gotten his boat to Tasmania. There was a debt holder on it who took the boat back, and he wanted to do the Velix race, which is a round-the-world solo, but with 4 port stops. And so the legs are about 7,000 miles each. So he took the boat, he finished that race. So the boat has actually now been around the world solo 5 times. Pretty amazing. Yes.
Rich, in layman's terms, can you tell us how your boat would differ from the most advanced technical
Yeah.
boat of today?
Yeah.
And in terms of, we could all appreciate and understand that.
Sure. The weight's probably about the same with the boat. Boat's not as wide. Michelle, in this email exchange, he told me something that was really pretty amazing, which was that his 2008 generation boat that won compared to his 2000 generation boat, he had 30% more riding moment, which essentially is equivalent to horsepower. So, and after that, he said something. It wasn't to try to sort of be disparaging. He just said, "Look, your boat can't keep up. It's not you. It's it's generational." And so, and the idea there was simply don't try to push the boat beyond what the boat can do. But I talked the next year with Arnaud Boissiere. He had sailed a 2000 generation boat also. His sponsor, this was the greatest thing that ever happened to that company, and so they bought Vincent Rieu's boat that had broken the mast in that rescue. Vincent's sponsor built him a new boat, so they bought the PRB, Vincent's boat, and I saw one of the preparateurs for that. I said, "What's it like, 2000, 2008?" It's just night and day, and so. These guys would be going along. There was in the south. There was you get some of the chatter from the other boats, and there was one where Brian Thompson, who'd gone aloft and got stuck aloft, had written, you always hit the highest speeds under autopilot because the autopilot has no fear. and then immediately thereafter, there was a quote from Michel Desjoyeaux, hit 30.44 knots under autopilot. And Loic Perron, before his mast broke, had the same thing. He said, I was in the bunk, we hit 29 knots under autopilot. We broached a few times, wiped all the antennas off the stern of the boat, but the boat's still going. So I think it was really a big difference. The highest speed we hit was sort of 24 and a half knots in that storm. Now, I'm much more conservative. I think these guys are really trying to win. I know that's not going to happen, and we have a different objective. And the other thing is that you have this, speed and risk curve. If you go 25 knots, well, that's cool and exciting, but it also means you've got this much bigger risk that something's going to explode. So it's much better to increase your average speed from 10 to 11 knots the whole way, rather than have these huge bursts of speed that put everything at risk instantaneously. It's like what happened to Mike Golden. His mast exploded when he hit 32 knots or something and was under pilot. So I tend to be conservative. Better to be conservative. A lot of these guys are like 20 years younger than me too. But better to be conservative and get there.
Even with your conservatism, it just seems to me that the speeds generated by your boat and the other boats, there would have been some cause or some risk of pitch poling. Was there any evidence of that?
No, we didn't. I don't know what happened with Jan when he buried the bow going that fast. One of the things that's happened with the boats through the years is the mast has progressively moved back in the boat, so they're moving the center of effort of the whole thing back a little bit. And there's with the extra beam as well. I mean, the boats are. Brian Thompson's boat was 4 feet wider than our boat. It was 22 feet wide, and so there's a lot of that beam is carried pretty far forward because when they're heeled, they're really making a very narrow path on the water. The boats are so flat bottom, most of that's right out of the water. And so they're going along like a kind of a canoe. So there's no real drag. So for going downwind, then you've got a lot of buoyancy up forward. So really haven't heard anybody pitch poling in these. Yes?
What happened to that poor guy
Oh, he eventually figured out something and got down. Yeah. No, there's some stories. I mean, Ellen MacArthur in the 2000 race had to go aloft in the south. Boat jibed when she was aloft. The mainsail crashed into her, pinned her up against one of the spreaders. She was stuck up there until the boat accidentally jibed back. And another guy, Conrad Humphreys, went aloft, and he got sort of spinning around one of the shrouds, and he ended up doing. Sounds crazy, but I think he said he did 19 revolutions around this thing before he finally stopped. And so he's stuck. He's done. Unless he figures that out, he's going to die up there because he's just, the top and bottom, above and below him, are wrapped around the shroud. And he eventually figured out a way to slowly unwrap himself and got down. But I wasn't the only one to go aloft. Arnaud went aloft. Loic was aloft. Mike Golding went aloft. He certainly. Not something it's not really a club that you'd like to be a member of. Yes. Yeah. That's the way it was built. Back in that generation, there were only one centerline daggerboard. The twin daggerboard's big advantage because they're angled outwards, and when the boat's heeling, then that one's more vertical than ours will be. But it's a big job to make that retrofit. That's an expensive job to put in 2 dagger boards through the hull, and it wasn't worth it, for me.
How long did you sea trial before you?
Well, we had the 4 transatlantic passages, so it was 15,000 miles, including 2 solo transatlantic passages and 2 double-handed transatlantic passages. And sailing with Mike Birch, also the Canadian guy, in those 2 double-handed was really good because Mike's really a legend. And we sailed back to France before the start of that race to Brazil. And when we started that race, we were the last boat to leave the harbor because the French public would not let Mike through the crowd. He is such a hero. And he had turned 76 the day before. Now, it was a huge honor for me to have Mike sail with me. And Mike and Walter Green in Maine are very close friends. And Walter had taken care of our trimaran for dozen years when we were doing those other voyages, and so that's how I knew Mike. And I mean, just another small anecdote, when we were there before the start of the race to Brazil, there was another birthday party for Florence Artaud, who was one of the great women sailors from France, won the Route de Rome race one time, a transatlantic race against all the guys, solo race. And she asked me, very kindly, she said, how did you get to sail with Mike Birch? Not like, how did you get to sail, but how did you get to sail with Mike Birch? And I told her about friendship with Walter and so forth, and she said, Walter Green and Mike Birch, the history of multi-hull sailing. So that was pretty neat. And Mike was really good. He's a fast sailor. And
one last, comparing the 2 designs, which do you prefer, the mono or the tri?
The trimarans are much less fatiguing because you're level. I mean, unless you're upside down, but you're, you're level basically. It's going to heal 5 degrees or so, but this being at 25 degrees all the time is really fatiguing, and that's problematic. Yes.
What was your main source of nutrition?
Yeah, fig Newtons. Yeah. Do granola for breakfast. Every 6 hours, it's said to have a full meal. Homemade granola for breakfast. This will be sort of the basics. We found a line of foil-packed foods that Bumblebee had for chicken breasts, salmon steaks, that sort of stuff for lunch. Dinner would always be freeze-dried dinner for 2 people, and then I'd have a pasta dinner at midnight with probably oatmeal and raisins stuff as the pasta got cooking. And then you just eat all the time. And 2 other things that were really important were obviously to keep hydrated. And so we found this Nestle's Nido whole milk, which was powdered whole milk. And it reconstitutes perfectly, and it has all the fat in it. Most of the powdered milk that we have in the stores here is non-fat. And I'd mix that with powdered Ensure as well to make sure I was getting all the vitamins and so forth. And I drank a lot of that stuff, plus Gatorade. And it's always going. You're just always going. And
the fig Newtons, that was part of it. 15 fig Newtons in a sleeve, 55 calories each. It's bizarre the details that you end up knowing after a race like this. But there's so much detail in something like this. All the cables for the mast or PBO is super strong, very lightweight, and they don't like light or water, so they have to be sealed really well. And so we made some modifications to that. You're doing everything you can possibly do to try to improve your chance even slightly of finishing this race. And so every good idea that anybody had, we would apply to the boat if we could.
Well, thank you, Rich.
Thanks very much, everybody. Good. Okay. Good. Thanks.